1779, Henry George wrote an economic treatise he called Progress and Poverty. Now, Henry George wasn't exactly an economist. In fact, he had dropped out of school in grade 7 in his native Philadelphia and set sail as a cabin boy on a voyage around the world. 3 years later, on his second voyage around the world, he jumped ship in San Francisco and went to work as a journeyman printer.
There were no schools of economics at the time. You couldn't study it at university. All Henry George knew was the work of John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, and of course Adam Smith. But he was the right kind of person for the job. He traveled widely, he spoke, he listened, he was an academic and an historian. He was the kind of person that could put all these thoughts together into a new way of looking at economics and society.
Henry George was fortunate. He got to watch San Francisco grow from a tent town of mud into a thriving metropolis with good roads and great housing and trams and buses. But at the same time, he noticed with the rise of affluence and wealth, there was also a degradation. There was the beginning of pauperism. And he was determined to find out why that happened.
The result of the inquiry, Progress and Poverty, is simply written, but so beautifully that it has been compared to the greatest works of the English language. However, George was totally unknown, and no one would print his book, so he and his friends, also printers, published an author's edition which soon found its way into the hands of a New York publisher, D. Appleton and Company. An English edition soon followed which aroused enormous interest. Alfred Russel Wallace, English scientist and writer, called it the most remarkable work of the present century, and soon George was known internationally.
In his lifetime, Henry George became the third most famous person in the United States. The top two contenders were Thomas Edison and Mark Twain. His books were translated into many languages. He received enthusiastic praise from many of the great and influential thinkers of his day.
So when Tolstoy talked about Henry George, he really talked about the fact that people really didn't refute George. It was just in fact that they ignored him. In fact, they hushed him up. Those people simply didn't understand. John Dewey fervently stressed the originality of George's work. George, he said, as an original philosopher, as a social philosopher, ranked very highly. In fact, he mentioned that from Plato on down to modern times, you could rank Henry George among a number of people who would count no more than the fingers on two hands.
Bernard Shaw, in a letter to George's daughter, Anna George, years later wrote, "Your father found me a literary dilettante, a militant rationalist in religion, and a barren rascal at that. But by turning my mind to economics, he made a man of me."
Inevitably, Henry George was as reviled as he was idolized. But the people who believed in what he was advocating for called themselves disciples, and they were nothing less. Fighting to the death, haranguing, advocating, proselytizing, all of his ideas.
But this was not implemented by blood. It was not forced on people, so shortly after George's death, this idea was forgotten. Once a badge of honor, single taxer went into disuse.
Except Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and scattered cities around the world, his social plan has been widely neglected, whereas those of Marx, Keynes, Friedman, and Galbraith have been well known, and those of Marx have been implemented throughout large parts of the world at times.
But nothing that has been tried satisfies. We, the people, are locked in a death grapple, and nothing our leaders offer or are willing to offer mitigates our troubles. Henry George said, The people must think, because the people alone can act.
We've reached a deplorable circumstance where much of the planet's resources, means of production, and property are in control of the few. This proverbial 1% virtually pay no taxes and exist well insulated from the daily realities of the rest of society. As a result, the poor, who have nothing, have become the object of compulsory charity.
And the rest, the workers, the middle class, the backbone of our economy, are made to support the powerful few with their labor.
You know, we're taxed at every stage in our lives, in all that we earn, all of our savings, and on much of what we inherit as well. At every stage of the manufacture, and then again on the final product. The taxes are crippling, demoralizing, punishing, and to a great extent, you know, they are unnecessary. But the way that our federal and provincial taxes are interlocked is so deeply entrenched, it's hard to correct.
Or anyone interested in doing so.
Moreover, it survives because it is based on bewilderment. It is maintained in a manner so bizarre and intricate that it is impossible for the ordinary citizen to know what he owes his government except the taxes to support a highly paid, dysfunctional bureaucracy.
All this is galling and destructive, and it is still, in the end, superficial. The great sinister fact, the one we must live with, is that we're giving up our sovereignty. The nation is no longer comprised of the people of its provinces and territories, but is ruled by the real powers, the corporations. They own the bulk of our resources, which is the same concentration of ownership that George saw evolving and warned us against.
These corporations are not Canadian anymore. They are multinationals. Transcending nations, they serve not their country's interest, but their own. They manipulate our tax policies in order to benefit themselves. They are autonomous. They do not need to coin money or raise armies. They use ours.
The powerful unions rise up in opposition, but in the meantime, the governments, both federal and provincial, get caught between the opposing factions and then legislate themselves, mounting power never originally intended for governments, exerting an influence perhaps seen as corrupt.
Georgians have no trouble with individuals owning the means of production. People need to own factories and businesses and machinery. That's how wealth is produced. The problem lies when a small number of individuals have monopoly ownership over large amounts of land or resources, because then the benefits of owning land and resources accrues to the few individuals and not to the general public.
Henry George believed that the taxing of incomes and consumption damages the economy. Taxing incomes makes people more expensive to hire. Taxing capital increases the cost of borrowing. Taxing profits pushes companies closer to bankruptcy. And taxing consumption raises prices.
Instead, Georgians promote the multiple benefits to society when government is financed by collecting economic rent instead of taxing jobs and businesses and sales. We should be financing healthcare, education, roads, all aspects of government through collecting unearned income instead of collecting earned income.
The means of producing wealth differ at its roots. Some is thief from the people, and some is honestly earned, but our inability to discern the difference between the two lies at the heart of our troubles.
And this clown civilization is ours. We choose this of our own free will with all the means to change things. Henry George's lucid voice points out basic truths that cut through the rot of confusion. Ours, like each age, has known this confusion, and each age has gone down for lack of understanding. Henry George wrote his treatise more than 100 years ago to avert such a calamity, to eliminate involuntary poverty and unemployment, and to ensure that every individual had an opportunity to reach their maximum potential.
This is simple. The ramifications may not be simple, but it doesn't alter the fundamental logic.
Even though George formulated and wrote his social philosophy well over 100 years ago, it has never been easily nor readily accepted. There was no better time in history than now to revisit George's truths and realize how applicable they are to society today.
We are on the brink. It is possible to have another Dark Ages, but in Henry George's vision, there is a ray of hope.